In the Second World War, the United States had no shortage of destroyers. Many of these ships, be they old four-stackers or the Fletcher Swarm, saw service that wasn't worth writing home about. Many more saw fierce action that tends to get overlooked in favor of Taffy 3 and the like. And then there's the destroyers that have one or two major actions to their name before reverting back to more mundane duties for the rest of the war. USS Smith is probably one of the latter. Here's a ship that had a fairly boring initial service life, then a single battle where she became famous for her stubbornness and refusal to sink, and then going back to mundane duty after she had her moment of fame. That one battle, though, was such an impressive feat of seamanship and dedication on the part of her crew that it definitely needs to be covered, along with the rest of her service, naturally, which began as just one of many destroyers built for the USN during this period. A member of the Mahan class, she was one of the destroyers that pioneered American design for much of the 1930s. Equipped with 5 of the new 5-inch 38 caliber gun, as well as 12 21-inch torpedo tubes, Smith was fairly heavily armed for the time, in spite of being limited in tonnage by the London Naval Treaty. Furthermore, with a speed of 37 knots, she was also fairly speedy. Not the fastest destroyer around, but not slow by any stretch of the imagination. Her construction was fairly quick to match, being laid down on October 27, 1934, launched on February 20, 1936, and commissioned a few months later in September. This speed would serve her well once World War II began. In the lead up to that conflict, though, Smith spent her time patrolling the West Coast. This being the late 1930s, there wasn't much else for her to do other than training duties. It would only be when the war began and Smith was sailing around San Francisco that things changed in this regard, as they did for many ships. In Smith's case, she would join with other destroyers as part of the escort for Task Force 1 in April 1942. In this, she would join with Battleship Division 3 along the west coast before moving back to Pearl Harbor on June 1st. Ditching the battleships for aircraft carriers at this point, Smith joined Task Force 17. Even in this, though, her duty was of the less exciting kind: convoy escorts, war patrols, and training exercises. Come October, though, and we get to the exciting part of her service. She joined Task Force 16 on October 15th, centered around Enterprise and South Dakota. Leaving American waters for the blood-soaked waves of the Solomons, Smith would be part of the escort during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Her part of the action began on the 26th of October, when the Japanese attack hit the American fleet. While Hornet was certainly the ship to come out worse in this engagement, the Japanese did not ignore Enterprise. When the carrier became visible to attack they did. Swarms of aircraft dove down on Enterprise and her task group, as Smith and the others put up a fierce barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Enterprise was, as you could expect, the main target. That did not mean the other ships were ignored. Even Smith, a lowly destroyer, ended up attacked by multiple torpedo bombers. In this, she fought most of them off, and avoided any direct hits by torpedoes as well. The problem came in the fact that one of those bombers had a pilot who had elected to become a proto-kamikaze, as Japanese pilots seemed to favor doing at Santa Cruz. He dove his plane down into Smith's forward hull, crashing down and bursting into flames. The explosion of the plane and the fuel it spread caught Smith's entire bow alight, burning fiercely from the tip of her bow back to her bridge. On most ships, this would be severe damage. On a destroyer, especially a relatively small one like Smith, that could be considered crippling damage. Yet, in spite of that fire and smoke, the ship kept right on moving and fighting. Her bridge was surrounded by so much fire and smoke that it was abandoned, yet the ship never stopped engaging. At its worst, the entire ship ahead of the number 1 stack was so badly ablaze that topside service was impossible. And some stories, notably a certain old History Channel documentary, claim that the Kate's torpedo detonated as well. I personally am somewhat leery of this version of the events. A torpedo, even a relatively light aerial torpedo, detonating inside the bow would have, if not blown it outright off, certainly done more damage than is generally noted to Smith here. In any case, through all of that damage and fire, Smith continued to fight. Her gunners downed 6 enemy planes. That she kept on fighting like that, even in the face of some severe damage, is impressive enough. What makes her story special in this regard is the actions of her commanding officer. This man, seeing his ship ablaze and unable to put out the fire with the equipment aboard, steered his ship, which, let's recall, had an abandoned and afire bridge, into the wake of the nearby South Dakota. This is where the title of the video comes in. USS Smith, ablaze for the forward quarter of the ship, steered behind the South Dakota, her own guns blazing away. As the battleship sailed through the rough seas, her shafts were kicking up a spray of water that Smith sailed right through. As the story goes, by using the rough wake to his advantage, Smith's captain put out the worst of the fire. Not many men would be, let's say, inspired enough to use a battleship's wake to put out the fire aboard their little destroyer. Regardless, once the battle was over, Smith had her damage under control. She lost 57 of her crew, dead or missing, with a further 12 wounded. Her usual complement, it must be noted, was around 160 men, so this is not a small loss. Couple that with her magazines being flooded, in addition to flooding from damage, and the fact that Smith remained in the screen with her serviceable guns trained to the sky, that's nothing to sneeze at. Even so, when the battle was clearly over and the Japanese weren't coming back, Smith was attached home for proper repairs. She would arrive at Pearl Harbor on November 5th and return to service in February 1943. However, this is where what I said at the start of the video comes back into play. Smith's following service would be a far more traditional sort of thing for an American destroyer in the Pacific War. 1943 would see escort duties largely in merchant shipping. She would do the odd shore bombardment in the later part of the year. And at one point in October, she dodged a Japanese torpedo attack that broke the back of the newer USS Henley. Smith attempted to sink the submarine responsible, but failed. When 1944 rolled around, she started it on the wrong foot. On New Year's Day, 1944, she was rammed by another destroyer, USS Hutchins, and had to go back for repairs. When those were complete, the majority of the year was, much as 1943, spent on largely secondary duties. More escorts, more training, more shore bombardment. The next excitement for Smith would only come in December of 1944, when kamikazes, proper kamikazes, were making themselves known. Smith would avoid damage at first, even when she had to watch her big sister Mahan be crippled and subsequently scuttled to damage from Japanese suicide bombers. It wasn't limited to destroyers. Smith was part of the escort when USS Kikkun Bay took damage from kamikazes in January 1945. She ended up taking on board some 200 sailors during the action, and transferring those men back when the carrier set off for repairs under her own power. Smith would then return to her escort and shore bombardment duties for the remainder of the war. The nearest the Japanese came to dealing further damage to her was a duel with shore batteries that saw a dud go through her number 1 smokestack. Retaliatory fire silenced the Japanese position, and Smith went along her merry way. When the war ended, she was quickly decommissioned in early January 1946 and scrapped in 1947. The USN had more destroyers of a modern design than they knew what to do with, and Smith was outdated and worn out. It shouldn't be a surprise she would be scrapped so quickly after her service was done. I do find a certain irony in that a destroyer hit by a proto-kamikaze, in a way, managed to avoid damage from proper kamikazes, even as the other ships around her suffered. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.